At the beginning, you said The Wrath of Khan was now considered to be one of the best pieces of Star Trek ever made. That's surprising, given that the motion picture came right before it, so say more. Oh yes, the motion picture made a bunch of money, but the critical response was justifiably lukewarm. From a marketing perspective, the biggest problem was that it couldn't seem to pick a lane. As a result, newcomers were both underwhelmed and confused, and established fans were nervous. So despite the success, Paramount still had a lot to prove with the follow-up. So what did they do differently this time? The biggest change was the budget. TMP had $44 million, Wrath of Khan got 12. Whoa, why such a drastic cut for a sequel to a movie that was so successful? Because with TMP, the production had ballooned out of control and they needed to tighten the reins to stay focused. They particularly wanted to avoid the almost decade-long period of false starts and infighting before production really got rolling. In determining the cause of all that chaos, they wound up pointing the finger at one person in particular, Gene Roddenberry himself. Not that I'm surprised, but why did they blame him? Because again, while he was a brilliant idealist and world builder, he was honestly kind of clueless when it came to understanding what really captivates a movie-going audience. Just to prove that point, consider that Roddenberry wrote his own idea for the next film, and the premise was that once again, the crew go back in time, but this time it's to thwart a Klingon plot to prevent the assassination of US President John F. Kennedy. Wow, he really wanted his time travel movie, didn't he? Yeah, so the suits finally said, listen, Gene, thanks for everything and whatever, but take this money and get your ass upstairs. With Roddenberry out of the way, they approached writer Harv Bennett and asked if he could write a good Star Trek film on the cheap. He said yes, and immediately binged TOS for inspiration, and while doing that, he realized that the biggest hole in the motion picture was the lack of a true villain. After all, V'ger was ominous, but not truly evil. So he endeavored to give Star Trek a proper villain for the second film, and in the TOS episode called Space Seed, Bennett found exactly the villain he was looking for, a genetically engineered superhuman tyrant from 20th century India named Khan Noonien Singh. Wait, 20th century? Very briefly, the backstory there is that Khan and his fellow superhuman augments were products of the real-life eugenics movement from the early 20th century. By the 1990s, they exploited their genetic superiority to forcibly seize control of roughly a quarter of all nation-states on Earth in a 5-year crusade that came to be known as the Eugenics Wars. They were ultimately overthrown in 1996, and fearing imprisonment and torture, they placed themselves in cryostasis aboard a pre-warp ship called the SS Botany Bay, which was then launched into space with no destination set. Wild. Then, roughly 270 years later, USS Enterprise discovers the Botany Bay adrift in deep space. Long story short, they bring Khan out of stasis, who then tries to kill Captain Kirk and take control of Enterprise. Of course, he fails, and Kirk decides to deposit the augments on an uninhabited Earth-like planet called Ceti Alpha 5. That's the synopsis of Space Seed. Okay. So anyway, with the villains selected, Harv Bennett's next task was to give Khan a goal to motivate him, and a plausible way to insert him into the story. He had some ideas, but wasn't proud of them, so he asked Jack B. Sowards to be a fresh pair of eyes, and Sowards suggested adding a weapon of mass destruction. Bennett thought that was too dark to be plausible in a Federation context, but then art director Michael Meyer suggested a terraforming technology that could be intentionally misused as a WMD. This idea was added to the script as Project Genesis. Cool, but where does Nicholas Meyer come in? I thought you said he wrote and directed this movie. Bennett, Sowards, and Meyer came up with the aforementioned elements, but the actual story they came up with lacked a cohesive polish and threatened to either delay or crunch the production. Nicholas Meyer had already been hired as director, but since his background was in novel writing, he figured he could tackle the problems in the script. He spent 12 days rewriting it, and even continued rewriting some sections while filming. He's ultimately uncredited as writer, but he's responsible for the final script being what it is. Interesting. What do you think made this story so compelling? Well, one thing you need to know is that though they didn't really plan it this way at the time, The Wrath of Khan actually begins a trilogy that continues with the search for Spock and ends with the voyage home. And while TMP treated the Enterprise crew as sort of an irreducible whole, like a character unto itself, and focused the story on the mission at hand, not worrying too much about any particular theme or character, by contrast, this trilogy is more like an in-depth study of three specific characters: Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, both as individuals and as a trio of best friends. And the themes explored through these characters revolve around age, death, and resurrection, but The Wrath of Khan specifically also explores vengeance. That sounds like a pretty deep and complex story. Fairly ambitious, I would say. But I'm guessing they stuck the landing, given the reputation that this film has. Like you wouldn't believe, dude. The dialogue is truly fantastic. Consequently, the acting here is arguably the best you'll ever see from this cast across the board. Possibly another thing for which Meyer deserves some credit. I'll admit the special effects are a far cry from the first one, but the score? Listen, it ain't Jerry Goldsmith, but this score put the 28-year-old James Horner on the map. No way! Like the guy who scored Titanic and wrote My Heart Will Go On, the biggest hit song of all time? That James freaking Horner? Yep, one of the greatest, most prolific Hollywood composers ever. But The Wrath of Khan was his breakout smash. Side note, I did an in-depth musical analysis of My Heart Will Go On a few years back. Check it out if you want. That's nuts, bro. But I'm curious about those themes you mentioned earlier. Age, death, resurrection, vengeance. Yes, that is worth talking about. While the trilogy does focus on the three big characters, it's no surprise that the bulk of the attention is paid to good old James T. Kirk. He's fresh off a sabbatical, during which he nearly retired from Starfleet to marry a woman named Antonia. But for whatever reason, he changed his mind and returned to Starfleet, resuming his rank of admiral. But while in the motion picture, he was serving as chief of Starfleet operations, his new role is to coach and train cadets at the academy who are on the command track. His star pupil is a half Romulan, half Vulcan named Saavik, who has shown so much potential that she landed a field commission under the rank of lieutenant while still technically a cadet. Impressive. Is Kirk enjoying his time as a wizened sage for hotshot cadets? Not even a little bit. He's restless as hell, agonizing over his age and perceived irrelevance, and it's turning him into an asshole. And while Saavik expects that treatment from a superior officer who's also a command icon, his old friends know and expect better of him. Uhura and Spock both make half-hearted attempts to call him out, to no avail. Only McCoy can cut through BS like that, and he does with surgical precision. It's a truly memorable scene between them where McCoy convinces Kirk to acknowledge the truth, that he's been languishing ever since he gave up command, and he's taking it out on everybody else. Oh, so there's the age theme there. And the death and resurrection, too, if you think about it, because he's, like, there, but not fully himself, and wants to be restored, right? Exactly! Kirk's narrative arc in this trilogy and in this film is one of coming back to life, so to speak. Which Spock also does in a more literal sense, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, but I won't spoil the details here. Sure. Now, I'm guessing that Khan is where the vengeance thing comes in. Khan has not been having a good time. So 6 months after Enterprise deposited the augments on Ceti Alpha 5, the neighboring planet in the system somehow exploded, which shifted the orbit of all the remaining planets. As a result, Ceti Alpha 5 went from being entirely livable to a desert wasteland. Kirk had originally intended to check up on them every so often, lest they transcend their limitations and become a threat once again. But he never got around to it, so the augments had to survive on their own, and they have, but not all of them. The dead include Khan's wife, a loss he blames on Kirk's negligence. Oh, so there's his motivation. Yeah, so pursuant to Project Genesis, Starfleet sends USS Reliant to evaluate the candidacy of SETI Alpha 6 as a test site for the project, unaware that it was destroyed. So they inadvertently explore SETI Alpha 5 instead and run into the augments there. Khan quickly seizes control of Reliant and leverages Project Genesis to lure Kirk back into space, swearing to avenge his departed wife by killing the Admiral. Sounds like one compelling ride. Now, I know we're almost out of time, so rapid fire, last second mentions, go! The militaristic tone is a bold shift for Star Trek and paved the way for future installments to lean on it with purpose. Also, Spock as captain for the first time is pretty darn cool to see in action. Chekhov is more central here than he's really ever been, which is cool. Savick is low-key hilarious in this film thanks to Kirstie Alley's breakthrough performance, and Bibi Besh plays Carol Marcus, head of Project Genesis. She's absolutely brilliant. Finally, the Genesis pitch reel constitutes the first ever fully CGI sequence in a feature film. Top-tier classic Star Trek and several significant firsts in Hollywood history. You should watch it!